Ethan Blackwood trudged through the familiar snow-covered trail behind his Appalachian mountain cabin, his 3 German shepherds fanning out ahead as they did every morning since Elizabeth's passing. Without warning, the dogs froze, ears perked toward a fallen hollow log, before Chief let out a low, urgent whine that Ethan had never heard in 8 years of ownership. 4 months passed before Ethan could bring himself to venture into that section of the woods again, but when he finally did, what he discovered beneath the rotting log made his blood run cold. A tattered wildlife research collar and blood-stained trap beside tiny paw prints leading straight to his property. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Blackwood property sprawled across 30 acres of rugged Appalachian foothills in western North Carolina, a rambling 2-story cabin nestled among towering pines and ancient oaks. Ethan Blackwood had inherited the land from his grandfather, transforming it from a humble hunting retreat into a home where he'd hoped to raise a family surrounded by the wilderness he studied professionally. At 38, the wildlife biologist's weathered face carried both the hardened resolve of a mountain man and the haunted eyes of someone who'd lost too much too soon. 8 months ago, cancer had taken Elizabeth Blackwood after a brutal 18-month battle, leaving Ethan alone to raise their daughter Harper, the 12-year-old with corn-silk blonde hair and eyes as gray as winter storm clouds had been diagnosed with mild autism spectrum disorder at age 4. Where once she'd been quietly reserved but functional, her mother's death had pulled her deeper into herself, her words becoming scarce as river stones in drought. The only consistent comfort in their fractured lives came from the 3 German shepherds that patrolled the property boundaries with military precision. Chief, the eldest at 8 years old, had been trained as a therapy dog for veterans with PTSD before Ethan adopted him. His serious demeanor and watchful gaze had earned him his name, and the other dogs followed his lead without question. 5-year-old Shadow, the only female, possessed a gentleness that belied her imposing size. 3-year-old Ranger, still puppyish despite his training, brought occasional moments of levity to the grief-stricken household. Dr. Morgan Rivers completed their small circle of daily life. The veterinarian had been Elizabeth's college roommate years ago, and since the funeral, she'd made the 40-minute drive from town 3 times weekly to check on the Blackwoods. Her practical nature and medical expertise grounded Ethan when grief threatened to sweep him away, though neither acknowledged the complicated emotions developing beneath their long-standing friendship. Winter had descended early and harsh on the mountains that year, blanketing the region in snow by late December. For the residents of nearby Pine Tree Valley, the Blackwoods remained mostly a subject of sympathetic whispers, the widower scientist and his strange, silent daughter living among the wolves. As some townsfolk exaggeratedly claimed, they had no idea how dramatically that perception would change, or how an unlikely discovery would transform not just the Blackwoods but their entire community. The January wind howled through the snow-covered forest as Ethan clutched Harper's mittened hand. They trudged along their familiar hiking trail, trying to return home before the approaching snowstorm strengthened. Weather alerts had warned of record snowfall, but their afternoon walk had been a necessary reprieve from the suffocating quiet of the cabin. The 3 German shepherds ran ahead, carving paths through the fresh powder, their dark coats stark against the white landscape. Chief suddenly stopped, his powerful body tensing, his ears perked forward, nose pointing toward a fallen oak that had collapsed during autumn storms. Without a sound unusual for any alert, he bounded toward it, Shadow and Ranger following his lead with unquestioning loyalty. "Dad," Harper whispered, tugging at Ethan's sleeve. It was the first word she'd spoken all day, and Ethan followed her pointing finger to where the dogs were circling something beneath the hollow trunk. Harper's grip tightened with unexpected strength. Ethan approached cautiously, his heart quickening as Chief looked back with an expression almost human in its urgency. When he knelt beside the fallen tree, His biologist's trained eye immediately recognized what the largest dog was gently nosing a tiny bobcat kitten, its spotted fur matted with blood, barely moving in the deep snow. "God Almighty," Ethan breathed, removing his gloves to assess the tiny creature. The bobcat's cloudy blue eyes blinked weakly, its breathing shallow and labored. The kitten couldn't have been more than 4 weeks old, far too young to survive alone, especially in these temperatures. Ethan surveyed the area with growing anger, spotting the telltale signs of illegal trapping, disturbed snow, broken branches, and worst of all, a thin trail of blood leading deeper into the forest where the mother had likely dragged herself after being wounded. Harper knelt beside him, her small body trembling not from cold, but from emotion. "Save it," she whispered. The second and third words she'd spoken that day, her eyes, so often distant, now focused intensely on the struggling animal. Ethan's professional ethics warred with his paternal instincts. As a wildlife biologist specializing in predator conservation, he'd spent his career advocating minimal human interference. Nature's ways were brutal but necessary. Wounded animals rarely survived for a reason. Removing the kitten from the wild would almost certainly disturb its natural development. Yet watching his daughter's face animated for the first time since Elizabeth's funeral shifted something fundamental in his decision-making process. More practically, with temperatures dropping below zero and a mother almost certainly dead from poachers' traps, the kitten had no chance of survival. What happened next defied everything Ethan understood about canine behavior. Chief, who'd been trained to protect and serve, gently licked the kitten's matted head, cleaning blood from its fur with paternal patience. Shadow moved closer, pressing her warm body against the tiny predator in a protective stance. Even young Ranger, typically buzzing with energy, lay down at a respectful distance, watching with uncharacteristic stillness. "Dad," Harper said again, with quiet insistence. "Please?" With the storm intensifying around them, Ethan made his decision. He shrugged off his outer coat, creating a makeshift nest, and carefully lifted the wounded kitten. The bobcat weighed almost nothing in his hands, its rapid heartbeat fluttering against his fingers like a trapped hummingbird. "We'll try, Harper," he said softly. "But prepare yourself. Animals this injured rarely survive the night." The walk home became a race against time and weather. The wind cut through Ethan's remaining layers, but he barely noticed the cold. Harper walked beside him with newfound purpose, her eyes never leaving the bundle in his arms. The dogs formed a protective perimeter, Chief leading with a vigilance that seemed to acknowledge the gravity of their mission. Morgan's truck was parked outside their cabin when they arrived, the veterinarian having come to check their emergency supplies before the storm isolated the property. Her professional demeanor cracked momentarily when Ethan unwrapped his coat to reveal their find. "Ethan Blackwood, what on earth were you thinking?" she hissed, glancing meaningfully at Harper before continuing in a lower tone. "You know it's illegal to remove protected wildlife from their habitat." "Someone's already breaking laws up there," Ethan countered, describing the signs of poaching they'd discovered. "The mother's most likely dead. Storm's coming. You want me to put it back so it can freeze to death or get eaten?" Morgan's gaze softened as she watched Harper hover anxiously nearby. With a resigned sigh, she gestured toward the kitchen table. "Bring my bag from the truck. We'll need to warm it gradually. And Ethan," her eyes met his with professional gravity, "don't let Harper get attached. This isn't a stray kitten. It's a wild predator with virtually no chance of survival. Even if it lives, it can never be a pet." As they worked to save the tiny bobcat, none of them could possibly imagine how completely wrong Morgan's last statement would prove to be. The bobcat kitten survived that first night against all medical probability. Morgan had worked until past midnight, carefully cleaning wounds, administering fluids, and setting up a makeshift incubator using a plastic storage bin, heating pad, and old towels. When she finally left, navigating the treacherous mountain roads before they became impassable, her parting words to Ethan had been clear: "Don't name it. Don't let Harper name it. This isn't a beginning, it's just postponing the inevitable." But when morning broke and Ethan checked on their patient, he discovered not only that the bobcat was still breathing, but that all 3 German shepherds had somehow managed to position themselves around the plastic bin. Chief lay closest, his large body pressed against the bin's side where the heating pad created warmth. Shadow and Ranger flanked the other sides, maintaining a vigilant triangle of protection. Harper stood in the doorway, watching this tableau with quiet intensity. "Wilder," she said suddenly, the word cutting through the silence. "What's that, sweetheart?" Ethan asked, startled by her spontaneous speech. "His name is Wilder," she repeated, stepping fully into the room and approaching the bin. The dogs made no move to block her, though Chief's eyes tracked her carefully. "Because he's wild, but he's also here with us now." Ethan wanted to remind her of Morgan's warning, to explain again the difference between temporary medical care and permanent adoption. But the words died in his throat. Harper had spoken more in the past 24 hours than she had in the prior month. Her face, typically blank since Elizabeth's death, now showed animation and purpose. The snowstorm became one of the worst in North Carolina's recorded history, dropping over 3 feet in their area and cutting off access to the mountain communities for nearly 2 weeks. During this enforced isolation, something remarkable began to unfold in the Blackwood household. By the 4th day, Wilder's cloudy eyes had cleared to a brilliant amber. His wounds, likely inflicted when he'd been caught in the same trap that had claimed his mother, began to heal under Morgan's instructions, delivered via satellite phone. Most surprising was his acceptance of the German shepherds, who had appointed themselves his guardians and companions. Chief, ever the leader, established the rules of engagement. When the bobcat kitten grew strong enough to climb out of his bin, the elder dog would gently pick him up by the scruff and return him to safety. Shadow appointed herself Wilder's groomer, cleaning his spotted fur with maternal dedication. Young Ranger, after an initial period of jealousy, became Wilder's first playmate, teaching the fundamentals of pouncing and chasing through careful demonstration. By the end of the first week, Harper had set up permanent residence on the floor beside Wilder's growing enclosure, reading aloud from her science books and nature guides. Ethan observed with quiet amazement as his previously withdrawn daughter explained hibernation patterns to the attentive kitten, her voice growing stronger with each passing day. "He's listening, Dad," she insisted when Ethan came to bring her dinner one evening. "He understands more than regular cats." Ethan didn't correct her anthropomorphism. As a scientist, he knew better. But as a father watching his child emerge from grief's cocoon, he kept his professional opinions to himself. The roads cleared enough for travel by mid-February, and Morgan's first visit confirmed what they already suspected: Wilder was not merely surviving, but thriving. The bobcat had nearly doubled in size, his movements now coordinated and purposeful. Morgan examined him with professional detachment, but even she couldn't hide her surprise. "His socialization window should have closed," she remarked, watching Wilder confidently approach Chief and rub against the large dog's leg. Bobcats this age typically hiss and spit at dogs. They're hardwired to recognize canines as threats. "Maybe he's imprinting on them," Ethan suggested, "like those geese that follow the first moving thing they see after hatching." Morgan shook her head. "That's not how it works with bobcats. This is unusual." Unusual quickly became extraordinary. By early March, as the mountain thawed under spring's first tentative advances, Wilder had developed behaviors that defied explanation. The bobcat kitten didn't move with the typical feline stalking gait, but instead adopted the confident trot of his canine companions. When Chief sat watching the room from his favorite corner, Wilder would position himself beside the German shepherd, mimicking his erect posture and alert expression. Most remarkable was his response to human interaction. Unlike wild bobcats, which typically remain aloof even when raised in captivity, Wilder sought out physical contact, particularly with Harper. He would climb into her lap as she read, knead her leg with his paws, carefully sheathing his claws, and make a unique vocalization, somewhere between a purr and the huffing sound Chief made when content. "He thinks he's a dog," Harper declared one evening, as Wilder attempted to fetch a thrown ball, clumsily batting it back toward her with his paws after watching Ranger perform the same trick. "He just doesn't have the right mouth for it." The transformation in Harper paralleled Wilder's growth. She spoke more each day, her observations about the bobcat's behavior showing insight beyond her years. She began joining Ethan for meals without prompting, eager to share new discoveries about their unusual house guest. One night, as Ethan tucked her into bed, something she'd resisted since Elizabeth's passing, Harper asked the question he'd been dreading. "When will they try to take him away from us?" Ethan sat heavily on the edge of her bed. "Who told you that might happen?" "Nobody had to," she replied, her gray eyes serious. "I read your wildlife books. Bobcats are protected. We're not supposed to keep him." The simplicity of her understanding made his heart ache. "That's right. Harper, he's not a pet. Eventually, when he's bigger and stronger, he'll need to learn to be a bobcat again." Harper was quiet for a long moment, absently tracing patterns on her quilt. "But he doesn't know he's a bobcat," she finally said. "He thinks he's part of our pack." As if to underscore her point, a commotion from the living room drew their attention. They found Wilder attempting to howl alongside the 3 German shepherds, his wild yowl creating a discordant harmony with their melodious calls. The sound was as imperfect as it was beautiful, a creature caught between worlds, finding its voice. That night, watching his daughter laugh for the first time in nearly a year, Ethan knew the inevitable confrontation with wildlife authorities would be even more complicated than he'd feared. Spring arrived in full force across the Appalachian Mountains by early April, transforming the Blackwood property into a riot of reawakening life. Dogwood blossoms erupted in white explosions against the forest's deepening green, and birdsong filled the dawn hours with complex melodies. For Ethan, the changing season brought not only natural beauty, but also mounting anxiety. As the mountain roads cleared and regular travel resumed, the borrowed time they'd spent with Wilder was running short. The bobcat was now nearly 4 months old and growing rapidly. His kitten fluff had given way to the sleek, spotted coat of an adolescent, and his movements displayed the powerful grace of a born predator. Yet despite his increasingly wild appearance, Wilder's behavior remained a perplexing hybrid of feline instinct and learned canine socialization. Each morning, Wilder would join the 3 German shepherds for their patrol of the property boundaries, trotting alongside Chief with what could only be described as dignified purpose. When the dogs stopped to mark territory, Wilder would pause and scrape the ground nearby with his back feet, mimicking their behavior within the constraints of his different anatomy. He slept curled between Shadow and Ranger at night, his spotted body nearly disappearing against Shadow's mottled fur in the dim light of the living room. Most remarkable was his relationship with Harper. The once withdrawn child had become Wilder's primary teacher and companion. She spent hours working with the young bobcat, channeling her own methodical nature into training sessions that seemed to engage his considerable intelligence. Wilder would come when called an extraordinarily rare trait in any feline, let alone a wild one, and had learned to retrieve items on command, bringing them carefully in his mouth as he'd observed the dogs doing. "It's like he's bilingual," Morgan remarked one afternoon in late April, watching Harper guide Wilder through a series of commands. "He understands both cat and dog languages and switches between them depending on the situation." Ethan nodded, leaning against the porch railing. The question is whether that makes him better adapted or hopelessly confused. He's not developing the hunting skills he'd need in the wild. Morgan's expression grew serious. You know you can't keep this quiet much longer. Ethan, now that people are getting out more, someone's going to notice. All it takes is one visitor, one delivery person, one hiker straying onto your property. I know, he admitted. I've been researching wildlife rehabilitation permits, but most states don't grant them for bobcats to private individuals, only to licensed facilities. Even then, the goal is always release. And what about Harper? Morgan asked softly. Have you prepared her? Ethan's gaze drifted to where his daughter sat cross-legged in the new grass, laughing as Wilder attempted to mimic Chief's dignified sitting posture, the bobcat's wild haunches not quite built for the position. How do I prepare her for another loss? The question hung unanswered between them, carried away by the spring breeze. Their borrowed time expired the following week when Harper's school principal requested a home visit. With pandemic restrictions finally easing, the school was checking on students who had struggled with remote learning, and Harper's performance had raised red flags even before Elizabeth's death. Principal Abernathy was a well-meaning woman with a brisk, efficient manner. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but her eyes held genuine concern behind wire-rimmed glasses. Ethan had arranged for Morgan to take Wilder and the dogs for a long hike during the scheduled visit, hoping to get through the meeting without incident. Fate, however, had other plans. A sudden spring thunderstorm rolled through the mountains just as Morgan was preparing to leave with the animals. Lightning struck close enough to shake the cabin's windows, sending all 4 animals into a panic. Wilder, now the size of a large house cat, darted from Morgan's arms and disappeared into Harper's bedroom just as the principal's car pulled into the driveway. "Keep her in the kitchen," Ethan whispered urgently to Morgan. "I'll deal with Harper and the animals." The plan might have worked if not for Harper's emerging confidence. Rather than hiding from the visitor as she would have months ago, she greeted Principal Abernathy politely and insisted on showing her the science project she'd been working on in her bedroom. Ethan's heart nearly stopped when he heard the principal's shocked gasp, followed by the unmistakable hiss of a startled bobcat. "Mr. Blackwood," Principal Abernathy said with remarkable composure as she backed slowly out of Harper's room. "There appears to be a wild animal in your daughter's bedroom." The following week brought a parade of unwelcome visitors to the Blackwood property. First came Ranger Jackson, a wildlife officer with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, his weathered face impassive as he informed Ethan of the numerous regulations he'd violated. Possession of a native wild animal without proper permits, failure to report a rescued wildlife specimen, potential endangerment of a minor, Jackson recited, flipping through his notebook. "I understand your intentions may have been good, Mr. Blackwood, but as someone with your professional background, you should know better." Ethan stood his ground on the porch, careful to keep the conversation away from the house where Harper was inside with Wilder and the dogs. "My professional background is exactly why I know that Bobcat wouldn't have survived without intervention. There was active poaching in the area." "Did you report the poaching?" Jackson countered. "The roads were closed for 2 weeks after we found him. By then, any evidence would have been buried under 3 feet of snow." Jackson sighed, removing his hat to wipe his brow. "Look, I don't doubt your story, but regulations exist for a reason. That cat needs to be transferred to a licensed wildlife rehabilitation facility." "And then what?" Ethan challenged. "You and I both know bobcats raised with this much human contact rarely succeed in reintroduction programs." "That's not my department," Jackson replied, replacing his hat. "I'll be back tomorrow with the proper transport equipment. Have the animal ready." Word spread quickly through the small mountain community, as it always did when government vehicles were spotted on the rarely traveled road to the Blackwood property. By evening, Ethan's phone was ringing constantly with calls from concerned neighbors and curious locals. Harper retreated into silence again, clinging to Wilder with growing desperation. Morning brought an unexpected development. As Ethan brewed coffee, steeling himself for the difficult day ahead, a battered pickup truck roared up the driveway. 3 men climbed out, led by a tall, rail-thin figure Ethan recognized as Silas Redmond, a local whose reputation for skirting hunting regulations was well known in the area. "Blackwood," Redmond called out, not bothering to wait for an invitation before climbing the porch steps. "Heard you got yourself in some trouble with the wildlife boys." Ethan stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind him. Chief slipped out at his heels, positioning himself between Ethan and the visitors, hackles slightly raised. "Call off your dog," Redmond said, though he maintained a respectful distance. "Just came to talk business." "We don't have business, Redmond," Ethan replied coolly. "And Chief stays where he is." Redmond's thin lips twisted into what might have been a smile. "Heard you got yourself a bobcat, tame one, from what folks are saying. Could be worth something to the right buyer." A cold understanding washed over Ethan. "You're the poacher." Redmond shrugged, seemingly unconcerned by the accusation. "Can't prove nothing, but I might be able to help with your problem. Wildlife Commission takes that cat. It'll end up dead or caged for life in some zoo. I know people who'd pay good money for an exotic pet, especially one already domesticated." "Get off my property," Ethan said quietly, his voice dropping to a dangerous register that made Chief look up in alert response. "Just trying to help," Redmond replied, backing toward his truck as Chief took a single step forward. "Think about it. Blackwood. Better the cat goes to someone who wants it than some government facility." After Redmond's departure, Ethan called Morgan in a state of controlled fury. He set those traps, the one that killed Wilder's mother, and now he wants to sell Wilder on the exotic pet black market. "Did he admit it?" Morgan asked. "Not directly, but it was clear enough, and he knows about the wildlife officer coming today." "Small communities, Ethan. No secrets." "We need to delay Jackson somehow," Ethan said. "I need time to figure this out." The delay came from an unexpected source. Mid-morning, as Ethan was helping Harper say her goodbyes to Wilder, a group of vehicles turned into the long driveway. At first he feared Redmond had returned with reinforcements, but instead he found himself facing a small crowd of local families, several holding hand-painted signs reading, "Save Wilder and let him stay." Among them was Tom Littlefeather, whose family had lived in the region for generations and who served on the town council. His granddaughter Penny stood beside him, clutching a folder full of papers. "Ethan," Tom greeted him with a solemn nod. "Penny here saw your girl's videos online. Told me the whole story about this bobcat raised by dogs. Thought you could use some community support." Ethan blinked in confusion. "Videos." The explanation came tumbling out from Penny, a classmate of Harper's who had remained connected with her through their online schooling platform. Unknown to Ethan, Harper had been documenting Wilder's development and sharing the videos through a private channel with a few school friends. Those videos had gradually spread through the community, creating a groundswell of interest in the unusual animal family. "Everyone's seen how special he is," Penny explained, "and how he's helped Harper. It's not right for them to take him away." The impromptu gathering grew throughout the morning. By noon, more than 30 people filled the Blackwood's front yard, creating what could only be described as a peaceful protest. When Ranger Jackson arrived with a transport cage and 2 assistants, he found his path blocked by a wall of determined local residents. "This is interference with a wildlife officer in the performance of his duties," Jackson warned, though he made no move to push through the crowd. "I could cite every one of you." "Then you'll have to cite me first." came a new voice. Morgan pushed through the crowd, a thick folder tucked under her arm. "I brought something you need to see. Ranger Jackson." Inside the folder was a hastily assembled but professionally documented case study of Wilder's development. Morgan had compiled Harper's videos, Ethan's observational notes, and her own veterinary assessments into a compelling scientific record of cross-species socialization. "This isn't just about sentiment," Morgan explained, spreading the documents on the hood of Jackson's truck. "This is a unique behavioral case that deserves proper scientific consideration before any decisions are made." Jackson reviewed the materials with growing interest despite his obvious desire to maintain professional detachment. "This doesn't change the law. Dr. Rivers, I have my orders." "Then change the orders," came another voice. Principal Abernathy had arrived, her usual severe expression softened with determination. "I've brought someone who might help." Beside her stood a slight man in wire-rimmed glasses and a rumpled suit. He introduced himself as Dr. Lewis from the State University's Biology Department. "I've reviewed the preliminary materials Dr. Rivers sent over," he said, extending a hand to Jackson. "This case presents unique research opportunities. Would you consider a temporary stay while we prepare a formal research proposal?" The standoff lasted through the afternoon, with Jackson making phone calls from his vehicle while the crowd maintained their peaceful vigil. Harper watched wide-eyed from the porch, Wilder surprisingly calm in her arms despite the commotion. The 3 German shepherds positioned themselves protectively around them, Chief standing guard at the top of the steps, allowing no one to approach without permission. As shadows lengthened across the yard, Jackson finally emerged from his vehicle with a tight expression. "I've spoken with my superiors," he announced. "They've agreed to a 30-day evaluation period while the university prepares its research proposal. The Bobcat can remain here under strict monitoring conditions." A cheer rose from the gathered crowd. Harper's face broke into a smile of such radiant relief that Ethan felt his own eyes grow damp. "But," Jackson continued, raising his voice over the celebration, "I'll be conducting weekly inspections. The animal must be kept in a secure enclosure, and if at any point I determine there's a safety risk, I'll remove it immediately." As the crowd began to disperse, satisfied with this temporary victory, Ethan noticed a truck idling on the road beyond his property. Even at a distance, he recognized Redmond's lanky figure watching the proceedings with calculating interest. Their eyes met briefly before Redmond pulled away. But the message was clear: this wasn't over. The following weeks brought unexpected changes to the Blackwood household. Dr. Lewis arrived with a team of graduate students eager to document Wilder's unusual development. They constructed a spacious outdoor enclosure that allowed the Bobcat freedom while satisfying Jackson's safety concerns. Harper blossomed under the attention, proudly demonstrating Wilder's unique behaviors and communication patterns for the researchers. By early June, Wilder had grown into his adolescent phase, now weighing nearly 20 pounds with the distinctive tufted ears and facial ruffs of a maturing bobcat. His size and strength were becoming impressive, but his demeanor remained a remarkable blend of wild predator and socialized companion. "What we're seeing," Dr. Lewis explained during one of his visits, "is unprecedented in documented cross-species socialization. He's not just mimicking dog behaviors he seems to genuinely identify as part of their social group while maintaining his feline attributes." The research interest brought temporary security, but Ethan remained concerned about Redmond's continued presence on the periphery of their lives. The poacher had been spotted multiple times driving slowly past the property, and rumors circulated that he was attempting to find out where Wilder would be relocated if the research permit was denied. The situation came to a head in late June when Ethan discovered fresh boot prints on a rarely used trail that ran along the back of his property. Chief had been unusually alert for days, often staring into the forest with raised hackles. That night, Ethan loaded his shotgun and kept it nearby as he sat watching through the kitchen window. Morgan arrived the following morning to find Ethan exhausted but vigilant. "You can't keep this up," she said softly, pouring him another cup of coffee. "If Redmond's planning something, you need help." "Jackson doesn't take the threat seriously," Ethan replied. "Says there's no evidence linking Redmond to any poaching, just my word against his." "Then we need to get evidence," Morgan said decisively. "And I think I know how." Their plan was simple but clever. Using trail cameras borrowed from Dr. Lewis's department, they established a surveillance perimeter around the property. The cameras were motion-activated, designed for wildlife research but perfectly suitable for catching human trespassers. Morgan also reached out to Tom Littlefeather, whose connections in the community ran deep, asking him to keep an ear out for any unusual activity or conversations involving Redmond. "Time's running out," Ethan told Morgan as they positioned the last camera. "The 30-day evaluation period ends next week. If the research permit isn't approved, Morgan's hand closed over his, warm and steady. "One problem at a time. Ethan, let's deal with Redmond first." They didn't have to wait long. 2 nights later, as a summer storm rolled through the mountains, the security measures proved their worth. A camera near the eastern property line captured clear images of Redmond and another man examining the outdoor enclosure where Wilder spent his days. The footage showed them testing the lock and discussing something the camera's microphone couldn't pick up over the storm's rumble. Ethan immediately sent the footage to Ranger Jackson, who arrived the next morning with a more receptive attitude. "This isn't proof of poaching," he cautioned, "but it's definitely trespassing and possible attempted theft. I'll pay Mr. Redmond a visit." The confrontation must have been effective because Redmond's truck vanished from their road in the days that followed, but the respite brought little comfort as the end of the evaluation period loomed. Dr. Lewis submitted his research proposal, requesting a year-long study of Wilder's development and behavior patterns. But approval would come from higher authorities who might be less swayed by the Bobcat's unique situation. On the final evening before Jackson's decision was due, Ethan found Harper sitting in Wilder's outdoor enclosure. The Bobcat curled beside her while the 3 German shepherds lay in a protective semicircle around them both. Chief's head rested on his paws, his dark eyes tracking Ethan's approach with steady awareness. "Are they going to take him away tomorrow?" Harper asked without looking up, her fingers gently stroking the Bobcat's spotted fur. Ethan settled beside her on the soft cedar mulch that lined the enclosure. "I don't know, sweetheart. Dr. Lewis has made a very good case for why Wilder should stay for the research project, but there are rules about wild animals." "He's not just a wild animal," Harper said firmly. "He's part of our pack now." As if understanding her words, Wilder stretched and repositioned himself so his head rested in Harper's lap, looking up at her with the complete trust that had developed between them. Chief moved closer, placing his large body against Harper's back in silent support. "I know," Ethan said softly, "and whatever happens tomorrow, that will always be true." The morning of Ranger Jackson's decision dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the pines surrounding the Blackwood property. Ethan had barely slept, spending most of the night alternating between reviewing Dr. Lewis's research proposal and checking the security cameras for any sign of Redmond. Harper had finally fallen asleep, curled up in Wilder's enclosure. The Bobcat nestled against her side while Chief maintained his vigilant watch nearby. Morgan arrived early, bringing coffee and a determined optimism that Ethan couldn't quite share. "The proposal is solid," she insisted, spreading cream cheese on a bagel that she then forced into Ethan's hands. "Eat. You need your strength today." "Science doesn't always trump bureaucracy," Ethan replied, though he took a dutiful bite. "Jackson seemed sympathetic last time, but he's got supervisors to answer to." They didn't have long to wait. Jackson's government-issued truck pulled into the driveway precisely at 9 o'clock, but Ethan's heart sank when he saw not only Jackson, but two additional uniformed officers. More troubling was the animal transport cage visible in the truck bed. "That doesn't look promising," Morgan murmured as they stepped onto the porch. Jackson approached alone, his expression carefully neutral. He removed his hat as he reached the steps, a gesture of respect that somehow made Ethan's anxiety spike further. "Mr. Blackwood? Dr. Rivers?" Jackson greeted them. "I have news regarding your situation." "You've brought transport equipment," Ethan observed, nodding toward the truck. "Standard procedure," Jackson replied, though he didn't quite meet Ethan's eyes. "The commission has reviewed Dr. Lewis's research proposal." "And," Morgan prompted when he paused, "and while they find the research objectives scientifically valid, they've determined that the study should be conducted in a controlled facility rather than a private residence." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. "What facility?" "There's a wildlife research center near Asheville that's agreed to house the Bobcat for the duration of the study. Dr. Lewis and his team will have full access." "That's a 2-hour drive from here," Ethan said, his voice tightening. "Harper won't be able to see him." Jackson had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I understand this is difficult, but the decision prioritizes both scientific integrity and safety considerations." "Safety," Morgan challenged. "In 4 months, Wilder hasn't shown a single aggressive behavior toward humans or the dogs." "He's still a wild predator entering sexual maturity," Jackson countered. "The commission cannot risk—" The conversation halted abruptly as a new vehicle turned into the driveway, a sleek black SUV with government plates. A woman in a crisp dark suit emerged, her salt and pepper hair cut in a practical bob. She approached with brisk confidence, extending a hand first to Jackson. "Ranger Jackson?" she acknowledged, then turned to the others. "I'm Deputy Director Harmon from the State Wildlife Commission. I apologize for my late arrival." Jackson seemed as surprised by her appearance as Ethan and Morgan. "Director, we weren't expecting you on site. This case has attracted considerable attention," she replied, her tone revealing nothing. "I prefer to assess complex situations personally." Ethan felt a flutter of hope. Perhaps this unexpected development could work in their favor. "May I see the animal?" Harmon asked. They led her to the outdoor enclosure where Harper was now awake, sitting cross-legged with Wilder while Shadow and Ranger lounged nearby. Chief stood at attention as the group approached, his posture alert but not aggressive. Harper looked up, instantly assessing the situation with a perception beyond her years. She didn't move or speak, her hand resting protectively on Wilder's back. "This is your daughter?" Harmon asked Ethan quietly. "Yes, Harper." Harmon nodded and approached the enclosure slowly. "Hello, Harper. I'm Director Harmon. I've heard a lot about your friend there." Harper regarded her warily. "Are you going to take him away?" The director studied the scene before her, the young bobcat sitting calmly beside the child, the 3 German shepherds positioned protectively around them both. "I'd like to understand more about him first," Harmon replied. "May I come in?" Harper looked to Ethan, who nodded encouragement. She then whispered something to Wilder before turning to Chief. "It's okay," she told the dog, who relaxed his stance slightly, though his eyes remained fixed on the newcomer. What followed was a demonstration that no research paper could have captured. At Harper's quiet commands, Wilder performed a series of behaviors that showcased not just obedience, but understanding. He retrieved items, responded to both verbal and hand signals, and demonstrated the remarkable dog-like social awareness he had developed. Most striking was the moment when Harmon asked if she could approach Wilder directly. Harper nodded, then turned to Chief. "Chief, introduce," she said clearly. The German shepherd immediately moved to stand beside Harmon, then walked her slowly toward Wilder, essentially vouching for her safety within their unusual pack structure. "Extraordinary," Harmon murmured, kneeling at a respectful distance from the bobcat. "I've worked with wildlife for 25 years and never seen anything like this." The demonstration might have been enough to change the outcome, if not for what happened next. As Director Harmon was preparing to leave, promising to reconsider the commission's decision in light of what she'd witnessed, a commotion erupted at the edge of the property. 2 police cars pulled in, followed by Ranger Jackson's colleagues who had remained by their truck. Between them, being led in handcuffs, was Silas Redmond. "What's going on?" Ethan demanded as the officers approached. One of the police officers stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwood, we found this man attempting to access your property through the Forest Service land that borders your back acreage. He had tranquilizer darts, animal snares, and falsified transportation documents." "Documents for what?" Morgan asked, though she already suspected the answer. "For transporting a privately owned exotic feline across state lines," the officer replied. "The paperwork had forged signatures from wildlife officials, including yours. Director Harmon." Harmon's expression hardened as she approached Redmond. "Mr. Redmond and I have crossed paths before. His activities have been on our radar for some time." Redmond spat on the ground, his face twisted with defiance. "Just trying to make an honest living. That cat's worth 20 grand to the right buyer trained like that, rare as it is." "Rare," Ethan repeated, something in Redmond's phrasing catching his attention. "Bobcats ain't rare," Jackson interjected, confused. "This one is," Redmond sneered. "Check its markings against the standard. It's not just any bobcat, it's from the Highland strain, thought to be extinct in these parts for decades. That's why I set those traps last winter, tracking rumors of a female with distinctive markings." Director Harmon's attention snapped back to Wilder, who was now watching the proceedings from the safety of his enclosure, Harper's arm protectively around his shoulders. "Is that possible?" she asked Ethan sharply. I didn't consider—" Ethan fumbled, his mind racing. The Highland bobcat was believed extirpated from the southern Appalachians in the 1960s. There have been unconfirmed sightings, but no documented evidence. As Redmond was led away, still muttering about the bobcat's value, Harmon approached the enclosure again with new purpose in her stride. She studied Wilder's markings, the distinctive pattern of spots on his legs, the unusually rich russet tone to his coat, the slightly smaller ears than the typical bobcat. "We need DNA testing," she said finally. "If this animal is indeed from a subspecies believed extinct in this region, that changes everything from a conservation perspective." "Changes how?" Morgan asked cautiously. "The commission would have a responsibility to protect the genetic line, which would preclude release into the wild where breeding would be unmonitored." Harmon explained. "It would also significantly enhance the scientific value of Dr. Lewis's research." A new tension filled the air, this time charged with possibility rather than dread. "Does that mean—" Harper began, her voice small but hopeful. Harmon turned to face them all, her expression thoughtful. "It means I'm postponing any decision until we have DNA confirmation. The bobcat stays here under the current arrangement while we expedite testing." It was a reprieve, not a victory, but Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders nonetheless. As the officials departed with promises to return soon, he found himself standing between Morgan and Harper at the edge of the enclosure, watching Wilder groom himself with typical feline indifference to the drama that had just unfolded around him. "What happens now?" Harper asked, leaning against Ethan's side. "We wait," he answered honestly. "And we hope." The waiting period stretched through the heat of early July, bringing both unexpected challenges and opportunities. Dr. Lewis and his team became regular visitors, their research now potentially more significant than they had initially imagined. They collected hair and blood samples from Wilder for the DNA testing, documented his continued development, and marveled at the sophistication of his interactions with both humans and dogs. The story of the possibly rare bobcat raised by German shepherds spread beyond their small community. A reporter from a regional newspaper wrote a feature that was picked up by national outlets, bringing a wave of attention the Blackwoods had never sought. Ethan fielded calls from wildlife organizations, television producers, and curious members of the public, all wanting to learn more about the unusual animal family. Through it all, Wilder continued to thrive, growing stronger and more coordinated each day. His weight now approached 25 pounds, and his movements showed the powerful grace of his species. Yet he still slept curled between Shadow and Ranger each night, still came when Harper called, still displayed the unique hybrid behaviors that made him neither fully wild nor fully domesticated. The peace they had found was shattered on a muggy afternoon in mid-July. Ethan was reviewing research notes with Dr. Lewis when Morgan's truck roared up the driveway, gravel spraying beneath her tires. She leapt out, her face flushed with urgency. "Redmond escaped custody during transport," she announced without preamble. "The sheriff's office just called to warn us." Dr. Lewis paled. "Should we contact Director Harmon?" "Already did," Morgan replied grimly. "She's sending officers, but they're at least an hour out." Ethan was already moving toward the house. "Where's Harper?" "At the enclosure with Wilder and the dogs. I saw them as I drove up." They found Harper reading aloud from one of her science books. Wilder stretched out beside her while the German shepherds patrolled the perimeter of the enclosure. Chief's head lifted as they approached, his nostrils flaring. "Harper," Ethan called, keeping his voice deliberately calm. "I need you to come inside now." She looked up, instantly alert to the tension in his voice. "What's wrong?" "Just a precaution," he assured her. Opening the enclosure gate, "Dr. Lewis needs to check on Wilder, and there's a storm coming." The lie was transparent. The sky remained stubbornly clear, but Harper allowed herself to be led toward the house, the dogs following dutifully. Only Wilder remained behind, contained within the enclosure where Dr. Lewis promised to stay with him until help arrived. They had nearly reached the porch when Chief suddenly froze, a low growl building in his chest. Shadow and Ranger immediately moved to flank Harper, their bodies stiff with alertness. "Get inside," Ethan said sharply, pushing Harper toward Morgan. "Lock the doors." The forest edge beyond the yard seemed to shimmer in the afternoon heat, revealing nothing at first glance. Then a figure emerged from between the trees, not Redmond, but a younger man Ethan recognized as one of Redmond's associates. The man held something in his hand that caught the sunlight with a metallic gleam. Before Ethan could react, Chief launched forward with explosive speed, covering the distance to the intruder in seconds. The man raised his arm, the object now clearly identifiable as a tranquilizer gun. A shot rang out, but whether it hit Chief was impossible to tell as the powerful dog crashed into the man, sending them both tumbling to the ground. "Chief!" Harper screamed, trying to break away from Morgan's restraining grip. In the chaos that followed, no one noticed the second figure approaching from the opposite side of the property, Redmond himself, moving with stealthy purpose toward Wilder's enclosure. The world seemed to collapse into fragments of sound and motion, Chief snarling as he grappled with Redmond's associate. Harper's desperate cries, Morgan's urgent voice as she pulled the girl toward the house. Through the chaos, Ethan caught a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision. Silas Redmond, hunched and predatory, slipping toward Wilder's enclosure where Dr. Lewis stood frozen in alarm. "Morgan, get Harper inside now!" Ethan shouted, already sprinting toward the enclosure. Shadow and Ranger hesitated only briefly before following. Their instincts divided between protecting Harper and following Ethan toward the danger. Redmond moved with the efficiency of a seasoned poacher. He had already reached the enclosure gate and was fumbling with the lock, a canvas sack in one hand and what looked like a cattle prod in the other. Dr. Lewis had positioned himself protectively in front of Wilder, but the academic was clearly no match for Redmond's weathered strength and desperation. "Back away from the gate," Ethan commanded as he closed the distance, his voice dropping to a dangerous register he scarcely recognized. Redmond spun around, his gaunt face twisted with contempt. "Too late. Blackwood. This cat's my ticket out of this backwater. Been tracking the Highland strain for years." "You'll have to go through me first," Ethan replied, aware of Shadow and Ranger fanning out on either side of him, their hackles raised in perfect symmetry. A cold smile spread across Redmond's face. "Happy to oblige." What happened next unfolded with nightmarish clarity. Redmond abandoned the lock and swung the cattle prod toward Ethan, who barely managed to dodge the crackling end. Shadow launched herself at Redmond's arm, teeth closing around his wrist with controlled force trained to restrain, not maim. Ranger circled, looking for an opening. As Redmond howled and struggled to shake Shadow off, inside the enclosure, Wilder watched with eerie stillness, his amber eyes tracking every movement, pupils dilated to full black discs. Dr. Lewis had backed away, fumbling for his phone to call for help. The scales tipped when a gunshot rang out from across the yard. Ethan's head whipped around to see Chief collapse in a heap beside Redmond's now armed associate, who was struggling to his feet with blood streaming from bites on his arm and leg. "Chief!" The anguished cry came from Harper, who had broken free from Morgan and stood halfway between the house and the fallen dog. For one paralyzing second, Ethan's attention split between his daughter and the immediate threat, a second that Redmond exploited. The cattle prod connected with Shadow's flank, sending the German shepherd tumbling away with a high-pitched yelp of pain. Ranger launched himself at Redmond in response, but the poacher was ready, swinging the metal weapon with practiced precision. The sound of the gate chain breaking cut through the commotion. Redmond had managed to snap the lock, and now the enclosure stood partially open. Wilder remained eerily motionless, his wild instincts seemingly at war with his learned behaviors as the human conflict raged around him. "Come here, you valuable little freak," Redmond hissed, edging into the enclosure with the sack outstretched. What happened next would later be described a dozen different ways by those who witnessed it. Yet no description could fully capture the fluid grace of Wilder's response. The bobcat didn't retreat or attack as either a wild animal or domestic pet might have. Instead, he slipped past Redmond with impossible speed, darting through the open gate and across the yard, not toward the safety of the forest, but directly toward where Chief lay motionless on the ground. Redmond cursed and spun to follow, but Ranger was on him again, this time connecting with the back of his knee and sending him sprawling into the dirt. Shadow, recovered from the shock of the cattle prod, positioned herself between Redmond and Wilder's path, her teeth bared in silent threat. Harper had reached Chief by then, kneeling beside the massive dog with tears streaming down her face. The German shepherd's chest still rose and fell, but a crimson stain was spreading across his brindled fur where the tranquilizer dart had struck with enough force to pierce deeply. Wilder approached cautiously, his spotted body low to the ground, ears flattened in a posture of submission, unlike anything his wild genetics should have allowed. He made a soft chirping sound, neither fully bobcat nor dog, as he reached Harper and Chief. Redmond's associate raised his gun again, this time aiming directly at the exposed bobcat. "Get the cat! Silas!" he shouted. "I've got a clear shot." The shot never came. Morgan appeared from nowhere, swinging a shovel with all her strength into the man's back. He stumbled forward, the gun discharging harmlessly into the ground before spinning out of his grasp. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the thick summer air. Help was finally arriving. But for Chief, it might already be too late. The German shepherd's breathing had grown shallow, his powerful body unnaturally still beneath Harper's trembling hands. Blood pooled beneath him, far too much blood for a simple tranquilizer wound. The dart must have hit an artery, Morgan said as she dropped to her knees beside them, medical training taking over despite the chaos around them. "We need to get him to my clinic immediately." Ethan turned back toward Redmond, intending to secure the poacher until law enforcement arrived, but the sight before him made him freeze. Wilder had positioned himself protectively over Chief's body, his wild features transformed by something uncannily like human grief. The bobcat made that strange chirping sound again, then began methodically licking the wound on Chief's side, cleaning the blood away with his rough tongue just as a mother cat would tend to an injured kitten. "Ethan," Morgan called urgently, "we're losing him." The next hours passed in a blur of motion and emotion. Sheriff's deputies arrived to take Redmond and his accomplice into custody. Director Harmon appeared with wildlife officers and a team of veterinarians. Chief was carefully loaded into Morgan's truck and rushed to her clinic, Harper refusing to leave his side. Shadow and Ranger were examined for injuries, both suffering from minor wounds but nothing life-threatening. Through it all, Wilder remained unnaturally calm, allowing himself to be temporarily caged only after watching Chief being taken away. The bobcat's behavior, his deliberate choice to run toward danger rather than away from it. His apparent understanding of Chief's injury became yet another data point in the increasingly remarkable case study. Night had fallen by the time Ethan received Morgan's call from the clinic. He had been sitting on the porch steps with Shadow and Ranger flanking him in silent vigil, all three watching the long driveway for headlights that would signal Harper's return. "Ethan." Morgan's voice was raw with exhaustion. "The dart. It wasn't just a tranquilizer. It was laced with something else, some kind of homemade poison. We're doing everything we can, but—" The unfinished sentence hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. "How's Harper?" Ethan managed to ask. "She hasn't left his side. She's being so brave." "Ethan, I'll be there in 20 minutes. The rural veterinary clinic was normally closed at this hour, but lights blazed from every window when Ethan arrived. Inside, he found a scene that would remain etched in his memory forever. Harper sitting cross-legged on the floor of an examination room, Chief's massive head cradled in her lap. The German shepherd's body was hooked to various monitors, an IV line delivering fluids and medication. His breathing came in shallow, labored pants. Morgan stood nearby with two other veterinarians, their hushed conversation and grim expressions telling Ethan everything he needed to know even before he heard the words. "The poison is attacking his nervous system," Morgan explained quietly when she saw him. "We've done everything possible. But his body is shutting down. He's in pain, Ethan." The implication was clear. Ethan knelt beside his daughter, placing a gentle hand on her thin shoulder. "He saved us," Harper whispered, not looking up from Chief's face. "He always saves us." "Yes," Ethan agreed, his throat tight with unshed tears. "That's what he was born to do." "Is he going to die?" Ethan couldn't bring himself to lie. "Morgan says he's in a lot of pain, sweetheart." Harper nodded slowly, her small fingers gently stroking the fur between Chief's ears. "He would stay if he could. He wouldn't leave us. No, he wouldn't." "But sometimes the bravest thing is knowing when to let go," she said, the words sounding far older than her 12 years. "Mom told me that before she died." The simple wisdom of her statement broke something open inside Ethan. He gathered her close with one arm while maintaining contact with Chief, creating a circle of connection between the three of them. "Would it be better to let him go?" Harper asked. her voice barely audible. "I think it would be the last brave thing we could do for him," Ethan answered honestly. "To take his pain away." Harper bent down and whispered something in Chief's ear that Ethan couldn't hear. Then she looked up at Morgan and gave a single, solemn nod. The procedure was gentle and swift. Chief's breathing eased, the tension in his powerful body releasing as the medication took effect. His dark eyes, which had remained fixed on Harper throughout, slowly closed for the final time. The monitor flatlined with a soft, persistent tone that seemed to echo the hollowness spreading through Ethan's chest. Chief, the leader, the protector, the heart of their unusual family, was gone. The morning after Chief's death dawned with a cruel perfection, cloudless blue skies, singing birds, and golden sunlight streaming through the pines as if the world hadn't irrevocably changed. Ethan and Harper returned to the empty cabin before sunrise, both moving like sleepwalkers through the familiar rooms. Shadow and Ranger paced restlessly, checking corners and doorways as if their missing leader might suddenly appear. Their occasional whines pierced the unnatural quiet. Wilder had been kept overnight at Morgan's clinic for observation, a precaution after the chaos of the previous day. Director Harmon had stationed an officer outside the clinic, taking no chances with the Bobcat's safety now that Redmond's determination and connections had been revealed. By mid-morning, exhaustion finally overcame Harper, and she fell into a fitful sleep on the living room sofa, clutching Chief's worn collar in her small hands. Ethan covered her with a blanket, then stepped onto the porch where he found Shadow sitting sentinel, her eyes fixed on the driveway. "He's not coming back, girl," Ethan whispered, kneeling to bury his face in the German shepherd's thick fur. The dam inside him broke, and he wept openly for the first time since Elizabeth's funeral for Chief, for his daughter's repeated losses, for the tattered remnants of the family they had pieced together after his wife's death. The sound of tires on gravel roused him some time later. Morgan's truck pulled up, followed by Director Harmon's government SUV. Morgan stepped out first, carrying a pet carrier from which strange chirping sounds emerged. Shadow and Ranger rushed to meet her, circling anxiously as they caught Wilder's scent. Director Harmon approached more slowly, her face grave. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm deeply sorry about Chief." "If there's anything the department can do—" "You can start by telling me what happens now," Ethan interrupted, his voice rough from crying. "With Redmond, with Wilder, with all of it." Harmon's expression softened with understanding. "Redmond and his associate are in custody facing multiple felony charges: poaching, assault, animal cruelty, attempted theft of an endangered species. They won't be free for a very long time." "Endangered species," Ethan repeated. Harmon nodded, a hint of professional excitement breaking through her somber demeanor. "The preliminary DNA results came back this morning. Wilder is indeed from the Highland bobcat subspecies, previously believed extirpated from this region. His genetic markers match historical samples preserved in the State University's collection." The news should have felt momentous, but Ethan could summon little emotion beyond the hollow ache in his chest. "What does that mean for him?" "That's partly why I'm here. The Commission has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow. Given these extraordinary circumstances, both the genetic significance and the, well, unique behavioral aspects, they'll be considering options that wouldn't normally be on the table." Morgan had released Wilder from the carrier, and the Bobcat now sat perfectly still between Shadow and Ranger, the three animals forming a triangle that seemed to acknowledge the empty space where Chief should have been. Wilder's amber eyes scanned the property continuously, his ears swiveling to track every sound. "He's looking for Chief," Morgan said softly, joining them. "He kept doing it at the clinic, too, checking doorways, responding to sounds in the hallway." "Is that even possible?" Harmon asked, scientific curiosity overcoming her professional reserve. Would a bobcat understand death-form attachment strong enough to mourn? 6 months ago, I'd have said absolutely not. Morgan replied, but Wilder has rewritten everything we thought we knew about cross-species socialization. The sound of the screen door creaking open drew their attention. Harper stood there, Chief's collar still clutched in one hand, her eyes puffy but dry. "Wilder," she called softly. The Bobcat's response was immediate. He approached her with the fluid grace that marked all his movements. Then did something none of them expected. He sat at her feet and looked up, perfectly mimicking the way Chief had always greeted Harper when she was distressed. Harper knelt and placed Chief's collar on the porch beside Wilder. The Bobcat sniffed it carefully, then made a low, trilling sound that seemed to vibrate through the morning air. Shadow and Ranger joined them, forming a circle around the collar, and for a brief, transcendent moment, the four remaining members of their unusual family mourned together. Director Harmon watched with undisguised wonder. "I need this documented," she murmured. "The commission needs to see this before making any decision." The official meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon at the Regional Wildlife Commission office. In the 24 hours leading up to it, a flurry of activity transformed the Blackwood property. Dr. Lewis and his research team arrived with video equipment to document Wilder's interactions with Harper, Shadow, and Ranger. Morgan coordinated with additional veterinary specialists who conducted non-invasive behavioral assessments. Word of the Highland Bobcat discovery spread through scientific channels with remarkable speed. By evening, Ethan's email inbox had filled with messages from wildlife conservation organizations, university researchers, and even international bobcat specialists. The Highland subspecies had been considered functionally extinct for decades, with only unconfirmed sightings and no breeding population documented since the 1960s. Wilder's confirmed existence represented a genetic treasure of incalculable value. Through it all, Harper remained quiet but present, answering researchers' questions with patience beyond her years while always keeping Wilder within sight. The Bobcat, for his part, stayed close to either Harper or the two remaining German shepherds, his behavior a remarkable hybrid of wild wariness and domestic comfort. "He's not displaying any typical displacement behaviors," one specialist noted with fascination. "No pacing, no excessive grooming, no redirected aggression. He's grieving, but he's doing it like a dog would, not a wildcat." The night before the commission meeting, Ethan found Harper sitting in Wilder's enclosure with Shadow, Ranger, and the Bobcat arranged around her. She was reading aloud from one of her mother's old nature journals, her voice steady despite the weight of recent events. "Harper," Ethan said gently, "it's getting late. The meeting's early tomorrow." She closed the journal carefully. "Dad, what's going to happen to Wilder?" Ethan settled beside her on the cedar mulch. "I don't know, sweetheart. The commission has options they're considering. They could still take him away." It wasn't a question, but Ethan answered anyway. "Yes. They could decide a research facility would be better equipped to study him and protect his genetics." Harper's face remained solemn, but her eyes flashed with a determination that reminded Ethan painfully of Elizabeth. "I want to speak at the meeting. Harper, these are government officials and scientists. I know Wilder better than anyone," she interrupted with quiet certainty. "Better than the scientists, better than Director Harmon, maybe even better than you, Dad." Ethan couldn't argue with that. While he had observed and documented, Harper had connected. Where he had analyzed, she had understood. "Okay," he agreed, "if that's what you want to do." The Wildlife Commission meeting room was packed to capacity the following afternoon. Officials in pressed uniforms sat at a long table facing rows of chairs filled with researchers, local residents, and media representatives. Dr. Lewis and his team had set up displays of their research findings, including charts documenting Wilder's unique behavioral patterns and video monitors showing footage of his interactions with the Blackwood family. Director Harmon began the proceedings with a clinical overview of the situation, presenting the DNA evidence confirming Wilder's status as a Highland bobcat. This was followed by testimony from wildlife experts regarding conservation implications and the scientific significance of the discovery. The Highland subspecies was believed extinct in the wild, explained Dr. Whitaker, a feline conservation specialist who had flown in from Colorado. Finding even one genetically pure individual represents an unprecedented opportunity for potential reintroduction efforts. The commission chairman, a silver-haired man with sharp eyes, leaned forward. And what would those efforts entail? Ideally, we would place the specimen in a controlled breeding program with any other Highland individuals we might locate. Genetic material would be preserved, and offspring would be carefully introduced into protected habitats. And this particular bobcat's unusual socialization. How does that factor into your recommendation? Dr. Whitaker hesitated. While the behavioral aspects are fascinating from a research perspective, they ultimately represent a contamination of natural instincts. For conservation purposes, we would focus on the genetic value rather than the behavioral anomalies. A murmur ran through the room at this clinical assessment. Ethan felt Harper stiffen beside him, her hands clenching in her lap. Dr. Lewis spoke next, presenting his research findings with passionate enthusiasm. What we're witnessing with Wilder isn't just unusual, it's revolutionary. This bobcat has developed a complex understanding of canine social structures and adapted his own innate behaviors to function within that framework. His cognitive flexibility challenges our fundamental understanding of behavioral plasticity in wild felids. The presentations continued for nearly 2 hours, perspectives ranging from purely scientific to practical conservation concerns. Throughout, Wilder was referenced as the specimen. The subject, or the Highland individual, clinical terms that seemed to strip away the essence of who he had become. Finally, Director Harmon announced, "We'll now hear from Ethan Blackwood, wildlife biologist and current caretaker of the bobcat in question." Ethan approached the podium, his prepared statement suddenly seeming inadequate in the face of the comprehensive scientific testimony that had preceded him. He looked back at Harper, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Wilder came into our lives during the worst winter storm in recent memory," he began. "My daughter and I found him as a kitten, barely alive, his mother likely killed by an illegal trap. In the months since, I've documented his development with the rigor my scientific training demands." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But what the data can't fully capture is the transformation that occurred not just in Wilder, but in our family. After my wife died, our home became a place of silence. My daughter, who experiences the world differently due to her autism, withdrew completely. The German shepherds, trained to protect and serve, lost their purpose." Ethan's voice grew stronger as he continued. "Wilder didn't just adapt to living with dogs, he helped heal a broken family. He gave my daughter a reason to speak again. He gave our dogs a new purpose. And yes, he developed behaviors that defy conventional understanding of wild predators. But isn't that exactly what makes him so scientifically valuable? Not just his genetics, but his adaptability." He looked directly at the commission members. "I'm not asking you to ignore the conservation implications of Wilder's Highland genetics. I'm asking you to consider that his greatest value might lie not in a breeding program that strips away everything he's become, but in studying how and why he was able to transcend the limitations of his wild nature." As Ethan stepped away from the podium, Director Harmon announced, "We have one final speaker. Harper Blackwood would like to address the commission." A hushed anticipation fell over the meeting room as Harper approached the podium. At 12 years old, she barely reached the microphone, and Director Harmon quietly adjusted it downward. Harper stood silently for a moment, scanning the faces of the commissioners with solemn gray eyes. She wore a simple blue dress that Elizabeth had bought her before she became ill, and her blonde hair was neatly braided, preparations she had insisted on making herself that morning. "My name is Harper Blackwood," she began, her voice small but steady. "I have autism spectrum disorder, which means I experience the world differently than most people. Before Wilder came to us, I hadn't spoken more than 10 words a day since my mom died." She paused, looking down at a small note card in her hands, then set it aside. "I don't need notes to tell you about Wilder because I know him. Not as a specimen or a subject or a Highland bobcat. I know him as family." The commissioners exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for such direct emotional testimony from a child. The chairman leaned forward with grandfatherly kindness. "We appreciate your perspective, young lady, but the commission has to consider scientific and conservation factors in our decision." Harper nodded. "I understand. My dad's a scientist. He taught me that good science means observing carefully and telling the truth about what you see." She took a deep breath. "And the truth is, Wilder isn't just a bobcat anymore. He's not just a dog, either. He's something new that we don't have a name for yet." She described, with surprising clarity, the specific behaviors she had observed over the months, how Wilder had learned to communicate not just with the dogs, but with humans, developing a vocabulary of sounds and gestures that bridged the gap between species. She explained how he recognized emotional states, responding differently to sadness, fear, or happiness in both humans and dogs. 2 days ago, Chief died protecting us." Harper continued, her voice wavering for the first time. "Wilder understood. He tried to help Chief. After Chief was gone, Wilder tried to take his place. He sat where Chief used to sit. He checked on Shadow and Ranger the way Chief used to do. He even started sleeping in Chief's bed." She looked directly at Dr. Whitaker, the conservation specialist. "You said Wilder's behavior is contaminated, but what if it's not contamination? What if it's evolution? What if Wilder is showing us that animals can change and adapt and connect in ways we never thought possible?" The room had grown so quiet that the soft whir of the air conditioning seemed thunderous by comparison. Harper stood straight, her hands now gripping the edges of the podium. "If you take Wilder away and put him in a breeding program, you'll be studying the wrong thing. You'll be studying his DNA and his babies, but you'll miss the most important part, how he learned to be more than what he was born to be." Her voice grew stronger, more passionate. "And I'll go back to not talking, and Shadow and Ranger will lose another family member, and my dad will have to explain to me why the people who are supposed to protect animals only care about what's on the outside, not who they are on the inside." When Harper finished speaking, she didn't return to her seat. Instead, she stood perfectly still, waiting for a response with the patient determination that characterized her interactions with the world. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Director Harmon finally cleared her throat. "Thank you, Harper. Your perspective is valuable to our considerations." She turned to the commissioners. "In light of all testimony presented today, I recommend we take a brief recess before deliberations." As the room erupted into murmured conversations, Ethan wrapped an arm around Harper's shoulders and guided her back to their seats. "That was incredibly brave," he whispered. "Your mom would have been so proud." Harper leaned into his embrace. "Do you think they'll listen?" "I don't know, sweetheart. They have a lot of factors to consider." Morgan joined them, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "That was the most powerful testimony I've ever heard. Harper, no matter what they decide, you spoke your truth beautifully." The deliberations lasted longer than anyone anticipated. Hours passed as the commissioners sequestered themselves in a private conference room. The crowd in the meeting room thinned as afternoon stretched into evening, but Ethan, Harper, Morgan, and Dr. Lewis remained, joined by Tom Littlefeather and several other community members who had supported their cause from the beginning. "What's taking so long?" Harper finally asked as the wall clock ticked past 7. "It's a complicated decision," Dr. Lewis explained gently. "They're balancing conservation needs, scientific research, legal precedent, and, he smiled at Harper, perhaps even listening to the wisdom of a very articulate young lady. When the commissioners finally returned, their faces gave nothing away. The chairman took his position at the center of the table and called the room to order. After extensive deliberation and consideration of all testimony presented today, the Commission has reached a decision regarding the Highland bobcat currently known as Wilder. He paused, adjusting his glasses. This case presents unprecedented circumstances that required us to look beyond standard protocols. Ethan reached for Harper's hand, finding it cold but steady in his grip. The genetic confirmation of a Highland bobcat, previously believed extirpated from this region, represents a significant conservation discovery that cannot be overlooked. The chairman continued. However, the unique behavioral adaptations documented in this individual present equally significant scientific value. He looked directly at Harper. We have been particularly moved by testimony regarding the animal's integration into a cross-species social structure and the therapeutic relationship formed with Ms. Blackwood. The chairman cleared his throat. Therefore, the Commission has decided on a hybrid approach that we believe addresses all relevant concerns. What followed was a carefully crafted compromise. Wilder would remain with the Blackwood family under a special research and conservation permit, the first of its kind ever issued in the state. The family would be required to construct appropriate secure housing that would allow Wilder freedom while preventing escape or interaction with wild bobcats. Regular collection of genetic material would be permitted for preservation and potential future breeding programs. Most significantly, the Blackwood property would be designated as an official research station, with Dr. Lewis continuing his behavioral studies under Commission oversight. Additionally, the chairman concluded, we are requiring that the Blackwood property be made available for limited educational programs to share the unique story of this animal with students and researchers. We believe this arrangement balances the scientific value, conservation imperatives, and the undeniable bond that is formed between this remarkable animal and this family. The decision was not met with universal approval. Dr. Whitaker visibly frowned at several points, but when the chairman asked if there were any official objections to register, the room remained silent. Director Harmon signed the provisional permit documentation immediately, placing it in Ethan's hands with a quiet nod of respect. As the meeting adjourned and people began filtering out of the room, Harper stood rooted to the spot, processing the implications of the decision. "Does this mean Wilder can stay with us forever?" she finally asked. Looking up at Ethan with cautious hope, "It means he can stay with us as long as we follow their rules," Ethan answered honestly. "It's not exactly forever, but it's pretty close." For the first time since Chief's death, Harper smiled, a small, tentative expression that nonetheless transformed her solemn face. "Can we go home now? Shadow and Ranger and Wilder will be waiting." The August sun was setting as they turned onto the long driveway leading to the Blackwood cabin, painting the surrounding pines in hues of gold and amber that mirrored Wilder's eyes. Morgan had driven ahead to check on the animals, and her truck was already parked beside the house. They found her sitting on the porch steps, watching Shadow, Ranger, and Wilder exploring the yard in the fading light. The German shepherds moved with renewed energy, while Wilder displayed his usual fluid grace, pausing occasionally to scent the air or investigate an interesting sound. "They've been like this since I let them out," Morgan reported. "It's almost like they know something's changed." Harper didn't wait for the car to fully stop before unbuckling her seatbelt. The moment Ethan shifted into park, she was out the door, running toward the animals with uncharacteristic abandon. Shadow and Ranger loped to meet her, circling with excited energy. But it was Wilder who captured everyone's attention. The bobcat, now over 30 pounds of rippling muscle and spotted fur, approached Harper with deliberate dignity. He stopped a few feet away, sitting upright in a posture reminiscent of Chief at his most formal. Then, as if making a conscious decision, he moved forward and gently pressed his forehead against Harper's outstretched hand, a gesture of trust and affection rarely seen in wild predators. "He knows," Harper said, looking back at Ethan and Morgan with shining eyes. "He knows he's home." As twilight deepened into dusk, the unusual family made their way back to the cabin together, a wildlife biologist finding his way through grief, a girl who experienced the world differently than most, two German shepherds who had lost their leader but found new purpose, and a Highland bobcat who had transcended the limitations of both his wild nature and human expectations. Inside, on the mantel above the fireplace, Chief's collar rested in a place of honor, a reminder of sacrifice, of protection, and of the unexpected ways that love could bridge the divisions between species. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, permits to finalize, facilities to build, research protocols to establish. But tonight, in the quiet of the cabin, they were simply home. In our twilight years, we understand loss all too well, the empty spaces left by those who once filled our lives with purpose. Like Ethan Blackwood, many of us have weathered storms that threaten to wash away everything we held dear. We felt that hollow ache when someone irreplaceable is gone. But the story of Wilder reminds us that healing comes in the most unexpected packages, often crossing boundaries we thought impenetrable. This remarkable tale speaks to what we've always known in our hearts, that love transcends species, circumstance, and even nature itself. It echoes our own experiences of finding connection when we needed it most, perhaps with a loyal pet who stayed by our side when friends couldn't reach us, or with grandchildren who pulled us back into the world when grief threatened to isolate us forever. The Blackwoods journey reminds us that family isn't defined by blood or species, but by who stands beside us when the storms come. And like Harper, sometimes the wisest among us are those who see the world differently, teaching us that what others call impossible might simply be a truth we haven't yet been brave enough to recognize. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.